Part 3. Mass Diffusion. Chapter 7. Import Licenses. The continuing fact, documented and instantiated in detail in the first 2 volumes of this study, as well as here in less detail, is that the system of faith that came out of Southern Ireland in the 1830s was immensely powerful as an ideational system. It created a new narrative from pieces of the Scriptures. This story was emotionally satisfying to the wounded soul and riveting for the intellect. The declaration that the entire Bible was a prophetic code gave believers the most seductive and consequential of cryptographic challenges. In the big picture, the ultimate achievement of the founders of the Brethren system was that their ideological descendants created a new Bible that made normative their beliefs. The Scriptures always were the truly big text, to be properly read, discussed, needed, and interpreted in thousands of weekly Bible studies conducted by the Brethren, and in the second half of the 19th century, by ever-increasing groups of American evangelicals who learned the technique of Bible readings from the originators. Then, as well, there were smaller, recent, and derivative texts that were a fully necessary component of the Brethren-derived system. From the 1830s onwards, the proto-dispensationalists produced a flood of texts of their own. Neither school of the Brethren ever had a formal publishing program, but they each produced a flood of material ranging from tracts to Bible reading scripts to multiple periodicals to in-house diatribes. The Brethren were among the first religious groups to understand the reality of societies in which the ability to read was no longer a minority accomplishment. The range of their publications was wide. The distribution was eccentric, but some were as powerful in bringing in adherents as were the direct missionary efforts of John Nelson Darby and those who followed him. Recall the Grant brothers being led to self-conversion from reading Brethren literature. So, sometimes these texts moved across the Atlantic, across the North American borders, with seemingly no more human agency than the postal system, and an individual ordering some books from a distant Christian depot. And of course, when acquired from reading cold print, the new faith turned to warm faith, and we once again see the interplay of idea and agency. A nice case is that of the sometime Reverend James Inglis, 1812 to 1872, who was just one statistical dot on the massive wave of European migration to North America, except that he was not just. He became a major, if eccentric and historically under-recognized vector in the creation of North American dispensationalism. One of the charms of Inglis, besides his energy and willingness to take risks, is that in his secular profile he fits so nicely into several of the major social ethnic pigeonholes in mid-19th century migration history. British Isles, Scottish, seriously Presbyterian, secessionist, full-scale family transplantation to the New World, settlement in the core area of the Great Lakes Basin, Detroit-Hamilton corridor, and later life career in New York City. Inglis was all these things, but he also became deeply spiritual in both substance and style, in a manner that had little precedence in his time and place. He was a textbook illustration of evangelical inculturation in the New World, eventually bringing Old World concepts into American radical evangelicalism, and simultaneously modifying the contours of those ideas to fit a very different geographic and social world. Inglis was part of the penumbra of Brethrenism in the 1840 and 1850s, before Darby began his North American mission. This was an era with scant records, when there were few direct old country testifiers, W.C. Baines and Ralph Evans being among the rare examples. Often, It was through reading Brethren books that scattered souls embraced Brethren ideas. Not all the system, but big chunks, sometimes without having any idea that there was a faith group behind the printed page. The early adopters were not a set, group, or class. Their encounters with each other took place at scattered crossing points and resembled the transactions of old country trampers passing messages to fellow travelers when they met by chance at border stiles. The first direct glimpse we have of James Inglis in action is in 1847, and it is not an example of a man of gentle innocence. Inglis at this time was a go-ahead Baptist minister. He was for a brief time editor of the Michigan Christian Herald, the effective starting point of his career as an editor and publisher. He raised a clatter by taking on The New Church and the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688 to 1772. This was in an editorial of the 18th of January, 1847. It is not readily available, but the reply from George Field, a Swedenborgian leader from Detroit, is rich in quotations from Inglis's editorial. "You speak of us in the most contemptuous terms," said Field. "You call us infatuated, and describe us as shallow quibblers on earthly mysteries, as using substitutes for religion, cloaks for infidelity, and you say that, in the cunning efforts of its ministers to beguile unstable souls, may not those we love be drawn into their pernicious way?" Apparently, Inglis feared that the people of Michigan were at risk from a loathsome foreign disease. "You thus conclude your chapter of expletives and declamation," Mr. Field observed. "Such a thing may thrive in the licentious courts and capitals of Europe. The people of Michigan will spurn it from their shores." There was a second editorial by Inglis, and a further reply by the defender of Swedenborg. The debate, if such it was, seemingly consisted of animated language by Inglis and attempts by his opponent to show that he had misquoted the foreign magus, and that in any case, Inglis had used indelicate language. Reasonable criticisms, one might think. Where Inglis came from helps one to understand and in part explains his staccato style. Here his family matrix is not a mere backdrop, but something close to a sharply bordered data set. James Inglis was the eldest of 4 sons and 4 daughters, 2 of whom died in infancy, of the Reverend David Inglis, 1777 to 1842, and Catherine Archibald Inglis, 1788 to 1833. Inglis père was a secessionist Presbyterian clergyman with a charge in Greenlaw, Berwickshire, Scotland. All the children who reached adulthood emigrated to North America, and that fact leads to 2 observations about the boundaries of James Inglis's life. The first is that the family was almost a Weberian ideal type of the stereotype, or of a fondly curated parody of the Scots on the make in the Victorian era. The children did very well by leaving Scotland. And secondly, they did well by plowing a field that we have previously shown to be particularly amenable in the mid-Victorian era to men and women of Anglo-Celtic origin, the portions of the Great Lakes Basin that centered on Toronto, Hamilton, Detroit, and to a lesser extent, Montreal, Buffalo, and Cleveland. So, for just a moment, observe how the family functioned as a loose but supportive company. 3 of the children emigrated to North America in 1832 to 1834. James, 1812 to 1872, whom we will discuss in detail shortly, Archibald, born 1813, and Anne, 1817 to 1849. This was classic chain migration. In the Tecumseh-Adrian region of Michigan, roughly 60 to 70 miles southwest of Detroit, 100 to 115 kilometers, they joined a cousin who had migrated in 1831. In 1834, Anne was the last of this family set to arrive when David Birrell, another cousin who had gone to North America in 1832, returned to Scotland and brought her back as his wife. That was stage one of the family migration. In 1844, stage two was effected. Anne and her husband David returned temporarily to Scotland and brought back with them to the Detroit area the family's unmarried sister Margaret, 1810 to 1847, and the family's two younger boys, Richard, 1821 to 1874, and David, 1824 to 1877. Effectively, the Inglis family had been transplanted. The children of the Reverend David Inglis of Greenlaw, Scotland, had migrated to one of the better opportunity points in the Great Lakes Basin, Detroit, and the area that later became known as the Golden Horseshoe in Ontario. Observe the two youngest, the ones in whom the parents at home had invested the most in their education. Richard, the second youngest, had been placed in an apprenticeship as a chemist and druggist in Edinburgh. Upon emigrating, he settled immediately in Detroit, and he and his older brother Archibald set up a drugstore. Archibald as the manager was a dead loss, and after 2 years the store failed. Richard thereupon enrolled in the Western Reserve Medical College in Cleveland, Ohio. He graduated in 1848, and in 1849 began a practice in Detroit that led to his appointment in the Detroit Medical College as professor of obstetrics. Professor Richard Inglis became a major citizen of Detroit, in contrast to Brother Archibald, who became a family embarrassment and a mystery. The youngest son, David, 1824 to 1877, took his first degree at Edinburgh University in 1841, then studied under the famous Reverend Dr. Thomas Chalmers, was licensed by the Carlisle, England Presbytery, and migrated to North America in 1844. He supplied the Scotch Church, Detroit, in 1846, and then various other places, including New York City, before taking St. Gabriel Street Church, Montreal, 1852 to 1855. He was at McNabb Presbyterian Church, Hamilton, Ontario, 1855 to 1871, and from there was appointed the professor of systematic theology at Knox College, Toronto, in 1871. Subsequently, he took a Dutch Reformed church in Brooklyn Heights from 1872 to his death in 1877. David Inglis received a D.D. and was a major figure in the push for Presbyterian union in the United States. So in 1847, when an obscure Baptist minister, James Inglis, serving as temporary editor of the Michigan Christian Herald, tried to take a verbal claymore to the Swedish philomath and Christian mystic Emanuel Swedenborg and his tiny handful of followers in Michigan and Ontario, this was not being done by a knuckle-dragging, self-taught, semi-literate backwoods preacher. James Inglis had family, and he had education. He had studied for the ministry at the University of Edinburgh, although he did not take a degree. He was a lifelong admirer of the Haldanes, especially of Robert Haldane, who had arranged and funded the education of so many, 300 to 400 lads from the British Isles in the Haldane brothers' style of evangelicalism, but he was not part of the Haldane flock. Mind you, in his first years in Michigan, he was something of the young buck, first opening a ladies' seminary, then becoming a reporter. According to family tradition, he lived a life open to severest criticism until he was converted by the Reverend Mr. Piper, another Scottish immigrant, and soon to be recognized as a distinguished Baptist leader. That was in rural Michigan in 1842. Converted to the Baptist faith, he married a co-religionist and was licensed as a preacher in 1843. In September 1844, he was called to be pastor of the First Baptist Church of Detroit. This was just at the time his two younger brothers and his older sister were being brought from Scotland to Detroit by his married sister and her husband. Not the family compact, but certainly a compact family identity existed. The Reverend James Inglis, he used the honorific off and on throughout his career, depending on whether or not he approved of clerical distinction or preferred spiritual democracy at any given time, had ambitions. One infers that the proximate cause of that perplexing 1847 screed against the Swedenborgians was that Inglis's immediate ambition had been balked. The object of his ire, George Field, efficiently pointed this out, that in the election of chaplain of the Senate of the state of Michigan, Mr. Inglis received 2 votes and Mr. Field 11, and Field was appointed. Thereafter, Inglis has to be described as a rolling stone, mixing pastorates and entrepreneurial publishing ventures at a menu of locations, but this does not preclude his having had genuine spiritual sensibilities. For reference, the following is a necessarily sketchy itinerary of Inglis's vocational movements. In mid-1847, he had a falling out with his congregation, and after scouting out opportunities north of the Great Lakes, in 1848, Inglis settled in London, Ontario, where he began a short-lived Baptist paper. He returned to Detroit in 1849, and in mid-year formed a new congregation, the Tabernacle Baptist Church. Then, in 1852, he again transplanted himself, this time to Hamilton, Ontario, where he combined a reflective sabbatical, he wrote out his main beliefs in considerable detail, and set up a religious publishing house. After a visit to Scotland, he returned to the Tabernacle Baptist Church in Detroit in September 1854. In 1855 he moved to St. Louis, where he began another Tabernacle Baptist Assembly, before a few months later declaring that he no longer was a Baptist. His congregation followed him the next year, voting to leave the Baptists. He lasted in St. Louis until October 1858, before returning to the Tabernacle Baptist Church in Detroit, and again becoming a Baptist pastor, at least for a time. In 1864, he was operating his publishing firm from addresses both in Philadelphia and in New York City. Thereafter, he was primarily in New York until his death in 1872. The obvious observation to be made about James Inglis's pattern of movement, besides noting the big holes in our knowledge, is that he was marking out much the same territorial boundaries that John Nelson Darby later did, with boundary posts in southern Ontario, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and New York. That pattern implies no necessary connection between the two men, merely that they read the socio-economic and physical geography of their era in the same way. However twitchy and flighty the Reverend James Inglis may have been, these characteristics were not disabling. One suspects that his various congregations and the cadre of writers for his religious publications put up with his mobility because his mixture of energy and innocence made him perceptive of new spiritual vistas, and these he shared with enthusiasm. Inglis is worth recovering as a necessary link in the transmission of radical apocalyptic evangelicalism, as long as one does not become too enthusiastic and recover things that actually are not there. He should not become the American equivalent of St. Brendan the Navigator, who is sometimes credited with discovering Iceland, Greenland, and North America on his spiritual journey. James Inglis did not on his own discover dispensationalism in the Scriptures, or become a self-created dispensationalist by meditation and doctrinal reflection. His work, consequential as it was, did not introduce dispensationalism to the United States. Earlier immigrants from the homeland had done that, or make him the formulator of dispensationalism, which became the foundation for all later American dispensationalism. What Inglis did was much less dramatic. He started reading brethren writings and amending his own views. By the time he took up residence in Hamilton, Ontario, Inglis was a convinced premillennialist, and a bit more. One finds him in that year lecturing on the mission of Christians to the Society of Evangelical Inquiry at Kalamazoo Theological Seminary. In its printed form, this was a very long lecture. Inglis stated that the universal triumph of Christianity in the present dispensation would be the complete refutation of Christianity, a rejection of postmillennialism that must at least have made his listeners on the hardwood benches lean forward. The Son of Man shall come in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory to end the present dispensation. Inglis did not articulate the details of the last days, but for the present he endorsed the binding precedent of the views of primitive Christian character and a primitive gospel, as opposed to the secularized aspect of the church as an imposing corporation. Inglis did not have the full menu worked out, but he was sounding very brethrenish indeed. In the year and a half he lived in Ontario, he apparently had no formal pastoral duties. He was a mature adult, 40 years of age, and he had two problems. One was how to become a player in the world of North American religious publishing. The other, deeper matter, was spiritual. How could he know more of God's hands? He knew whose hands held the future. But was it a future known only to him? Inglis set up in Hamilton as a publisher, James Inglis and Company, and put into print his then views on basic church issues as they related to the prophetic future. At this point, Inglis was at his best in his style of thought and communication. Unlike much of his later writings, which were produced under pressure of time, portions of his work during his Ontario residence were thoughtful and measured. For the most part, he wrote formally, but not stiffly. He nicely mixed paragraphs of formal theology with sudden wake-up sentences that slapped the readers just enough to keep them alert. James Inglis's early book, The Destiny of the Earth Under Its Coming King, was completed in Hamilton in January 1854 and published first by his own firm and then by the publishing house of Moffat in New York. Its preface began with a watch cry that was to become a conventional first salvo in much of prophetic preaching, a notice of the extraordinary state of affairs of the secular world. In this instance, Inglis pointed to the Old World. His readers were aware that the Turco-Russian War threatened to upset the order of Eurasia and perhaps all of Western Europe. Inglis himself knew that this conflict involved great powers, which prophetic adepts identified in their reading of the Scriptures as being part of the divine plan. Now, crucially, he granted quickly that the Church will have warning of the approach of the Lord. However, he intended to point attention to the more remote future, that the kingdom which the God of heaven will set up, and which diplomacy and intrigue cannot delay for an instant. Inglis's anxiety about the world's diplomatic fraying was not feigned, though it was rhetorically high-flown. The internal condition on the nations of Europe and Asia, and the mutual relations of those nations which are to be dragged into the world quarrel, render it certain that every expedient of mediation and diplomacy will be exhausted in the vain hope of averting the collision which will strew continents with ruin, convert the old world into a battlefield, and join the horrors of civil war to the devastation of international slaughter. Given that the cohort to whom Inglis was talking believed deeply that Jesus would return to rule the earth, and that a millennium was somewhere involved in the process, how did one decide between the two mutually exclusive alternatives, pre- or post-millennialism? Advocates of each side would point to proof scriptures and pretend to themselves that their decision was primarily biblical, but in fact, often was mostly empirical. How one viewed the world in the immediate and middle term could determine how one read the scriptures concerning the long term. Thus, Inglis's logic was in the first instance an appeal not to the Bible, but rather to the secular newspapers, and this later was to be the technique of whole battalions of evangelists who preached to evangelicals about prophecy. If the world was visibly going to hell, then one could not sensibly be a post-millennialist. The dark empiricism of most, not all, most forms of premillennialism as they had developed in the 1830s in the British Isles was a case of pre-evolution. Here in North America, a cultural form emerged, one that in the 1860s and later would fit the situation of many Americans who reckoned with the Civil War, and still later, those who joined the flood to the cities and experienced dislocation, alienation, and a sense of pervasive moral evil. These folk well may have been a minority of the entire population, but they were there in their hundreds of thousands, looking not for news, but for good news. By the late spring of 1854, the fruits of James Inglis's informal sabbatical in Hamilton, Ontario, were more self-publishing and detailed plans for editing and publishing a periodical. Hence, this is a suitable place to clarify a basic point of perspective that relates to the wider historiography of New World apocalypticism in the second half of the 19th century. There is a trap, a semantic slough that is potentially ensnaring. Too often, premillennialism as a term is not recognized as being an umbrella word that covers several forms of premillennialism, not just the particular one that the historian is keenest to discuss. This is especially misleading if one is dealing with the proto-forms of dispensationalism, where direct evidence of its evolution and adoption are hardest to find, and thus the historian's temptation is to point to every indication of general pre-millennialism that arises, and to imply that this ineluctably turned into the narrow sort of American radical evangelical apocalypticism that was clearly articulated in the late 1860s and 1870s. Because in his self-published writings, and in his soon-to-be periodical, it becomes clear that James Inglis, meditating on basic questions of the Christian faith, had taken in a lot of brethren concepts, one should ask, where did he find them? Almost certainly in his own reading, not from actual contact. In the early 1850s, brethren of any stripe were thin on the ground, even around the Great Lakes Basin, and Inglis gives no indication that I can find of his having met any of those saints, though that is hardly conclusive concerning any minor personal encounters. I think Alan Turlip deserves credit for recognizing that a set of conjoint lectures given by William Trotter and Thomas Smith in York, England in the spring of 1851, recorded in shorthand notes, corrected and published the same year, was the most likely source of most of Inglis's early ideas. This was 8 lectures on prophecy. One says most likely, not almost certainly, because Inglis, in common with many industrious Protestant writers of his era, was sparing in the acknowledgment of his intellectual and doctrinal debts, save to the Church Fathers and the founding figures of Protestantism, and outside of his written work, there is, thus far, no private diary or cache of letters. The identification of Trotter and Smith's 8 lectures on prophecy as foundational to Inglis's thought in the 1850s rests on their structural fit with Inglis's work, on those printed lectures being a substantive doctrinal paradigm that joins too closely with Inglis's writing to be accidental, on a rhetorical near-congruence of the two works, and on there being no other works of the same brethren character as the 8 lectures on prophecy, in significant distribution in North America at the time. The primary authorial force in the 8 Lectures on Prophecy, William Trotter, 1818 to 1865, was a very persuasive writer when addressing men and women who were within the circle of evangelicals who pondered biblical prophecy. Even putting aside his apparent formative influence on James Inglis, he was consequential in evangelical history because his major books were sold in quantities in North America in the second half of the 19th century and onwards. Fresh printings were still being published in the middle of the 20th century. Ernest Sandin correctly designated Trotter as one of the handful of exclusive Brethren writers who became well known in the United States. But to grasp Trotter's persuasiveness, it is necessary to recognize that he was a very hard lump of coal indeed, and that there is a tone running through his writing, independent of his arguments on any given point, that comes close to being bullying. At times the reader buckles not to his logic, not to his scriptural interpretations, but to the hectoring sense of his own rightness. Trotter had been a boy preacher among the Methodist New Connection in Halifax and York, England, and had been converted to Brethrenism in his 20s, before the Great Schism among the Brethren. In that split, he was a staunch, even fanatical Darbyite. He energetically attacked the Bethesda sinners, George F. Mueller, Henry Craik, and also Benjamin Wills Newton, both orally and in print. In the years immediately after the Great Split, Trotter went beyond what even Darby would countenance. A circular that Trotter and John Willens had written in 1849 to 1850 against the now open Brethren was withdrawn at the suggestion of Darby, who was briefly trying to arrange a truce. Other than that one time of excess, Trotter was one of a handful of writers whom Darby trusted to explain John Nelson Darby to the outside world. There is some profit in adding one further strong prophetical text that was just becoming available before Inglis began his Waymarks publishing venture. This was William Trotter's Plain Papers on Prophetic and Other Subjects, which was designed to supersede the Trotter-Smith volume. The book, like its predecessor, began life as a carefully planned set of anonymous tracts, each 20 pages in length, designed so that each could be turned into a chapter in a book without requiring much new typesetting. The first of these fascicules came out in January 1853, and each successive one appeared a month later, plenty of time for most of them to reach James Inglis while he was in his fallow period. The final one appeared in November 1854. Then all the tracts were immediately put together for a book, anonymous in its first edition, Trotter being named as author thereafter. This was a big book, 476 pages, covering in expanded detail everything that had been discussed in the 8 Lectures on Prophecy, and with 2 concluding chapters answering objections that critics had raised. It constituted an effective handbook of Darbyite eschatology. By the time in early 1854 that James Inglis started Waymarks in the Wilderness and thereby committed to his lifetime vocation as a publisher and still a part-time pastor, he was on the way to becoming an exponent of radical apocalyptic evangelicalism. His views were informed by, but not congruent with, those of the exclusive Brethrenism in their end-times doctrine. One might expect him to move increasingly in the Darbyite direction as time passed, and in some periods that seemed to be the case. But at other times he moved away. The road for Inglis was bumpy,